Welcome everybody to a presentation on planting native wildflowers and native grasses. I'm Josh Shields. I am the forester and the wildlife biologist with the Manistee and the Mason Lake Conservation Districts. For those of you that attended this presentation on February 22nd, we actually have to re-record this. We had some issues with the audio component of the file from the actual presentation. So the version that you're seeing here is going to be slightly different than what you saw on the 22nd, but the content will be the same. So let's start off by talking about why plant native wildflowers and native grasses. There are lots of reasons. Many landowners desire this because they're trying to convert poor habitat to better habitat. And what I mean by that is low quality habitat such as fields dominated by non-native invasive species such as spotted knapweed and smooth brome are considered poor habitat for our native wildlife. Some folks are particularly interested in organisms such as native pollinators. There's been a big push for this in recent years. What you're seeing here are some pictures of native bees on purple coneflower and purple prairie clover, as well as the famous monarch butterfly on milkweed. In addition to native pollinators, there are other wildlife species that people are interested in managing for. Some examples include the grasshopper sparrow, which is one of our native sparrows, as well as the Henslow sparrow, which you're seeing in the bottom left there. Things like the northern bobwhite, which is a native game bird, and a bird that some people find really cool, including myself, which is the bobolink. And that upper left picture there, I know you can barely see the bird, but that is a bobolink perched on a shrub in the middle of a grassland that includes purple coneflower as a component. So again, there are other wildlife species that people are interested in addition to those pollinators that receive a lot of attention. Another reason people are interested in native wildflowers and native grasses is simply because they're cool looking. They're very charismatic. And I agree. This picture you're seeing here is from a project I took part in southern Wisconsin. And what you're seeing there is a mixture of wildflowers, including wild quinine, rattlesnake master, gray-headed coneflower, as well as native grasses such as big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, and side oats grama. So this is a really cool success story, in my opinion, where it really became a diverse tallgrass prairie ecosystem. And it's visually stunning. So that is a very common objective in terms of implementing plantings like this. So whether you're planting native wildflowers and grasses because you want to promote pollinator habitat, or because you think they're visually awesome, or because you're interested in some other wildlife species such as certain birds or certain mammals, there's a process involved to making this happen. And that's what these next slides are going to cover. The first step is pretty obvious, which is selecting the site. There are multiple ways to go about this. The focus of this presentation, just so you know, is on these upland, non-forested habitats in northwest lower peninsula Michigan. So that really is going to be where I draw most of my examples. So we're not going to cover wetland habitats or other types of habitats that might support tallgrass prairies. This is really focused on a particular portion of Michigan and a very common situation that I encounter. In my opinion, the easiest site to focus on is a non-forested area where woody vegetation is already absent. So by that, I mean when you have these areas that are fallow, but they're infested with high densities of something like the non-native invasive autumn olive shrub or Asian honeysuckle or some other invasive shrub, there's a lot more work involved in getting that site ready. And that's still worth doing. It's just an extra step. So if you have a site that's already clear of woody vegetation, but maybe it's dominated by a bunch of exotic herbaceous vegetation, that's probably the type of site I would focus on in terms of priority. And that's what you're seeing on the right here is a field dominated by knapweed, brome, and then a smattering of other herbaceous vegetation, most of which are exotic. And of course, there's a few woody stems in there. Another disclaimer here is if you have a field that has quite a few native woody stems, you may consider whether you really want to clear that and make it into native wildflowers and grasses. The reason I say that is because those fields that have already been packed full of native things like white pine and black cherry, aspen, maybe you want to let those grow and simply become a forest. You have to really decide what your goal is. Maybe you have those young forest areas elsewhere on your property and you do want to get rid of some of that other young forest for the purpose of providing a different kind of habitat that's lacking, such as native wildflowers and native grasses. So context is really important here. In terms of actually choosing that site, well-drained sites that receive full sunlight for at least half the day are pretty ideal. And I agree with this recommendation from May et al. In terms of determining the drainage of that soil, you can use a resource called the Web Soil Survey. And I've got a URL here where you can go and find information on your soil type. If any of you need help navigating this site, just feel free to contact me. It's really easy, in my opinion, and you can get great information on your soil types. Another recommendation is to make sure your sites are not within a certain distance where certain types of pesticides are being used, particularly a type called neonicotinoids, which are harmful to pollinators. So if you're going to provide habitat for pollinators, it's wise to keep sites away from areas where there's heavy use of a pesticide that can actually impact the very insects that you're trying to promote habitat for. Choosing sites that are at least 0.5 acre. This really only applies if you're doing larger scale habitat management. So if you have a large acreage of land, then 0.5 acre is typically a wise decision in terms of promoting habitat at a scale where things like certain songbirds and small mammals can also utilize those patches. However, that should not discourage you from planting much smaller plots, because any conversion from a poor habitat to a native habitat is a fantastic thing, in my opinion. So if you have a lot, or if you have just a couple acres and you want to plant a small plot, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, 50 feet by 50 feet, whatever it might be, into a habitat of native wildflowers and native grasses, you're still going to have native insects such as pollinators come in and utilize those habitats. So don't let this minimum 0.5 acre recommendation discourage you from promoting some small scale beneficial habitat. So once you've chosen your site, you have to start thinking about site preparation. This is a very critical step, in my opinion, and probably the number one reason I see projects like this fail is a lack of site preparation. Essentially, the more effort that's put into reducing non-desirable vegetation, or the weeds, if you will, prior to planting native wildflowers and grasses, the less effort is needed for post-planting weed control. And there are multiple methods, which I'm going to cover in the next several slides. One method is to mow and rake and combine that with a herbicide application. So some folks choose to mow or rake the weeds during early spring or maybe a little later. Then they apply herbicides to the green up that follows the mowing or raking. So you mow or rake, and then the weeds are going to regrow, or new germinates are going to grow. Either way, once the mowing or raking is done, the green up is tackled with some sort of foliar herbicide. The general recommendation is to apply that herbicide once per month or every 6 weeks from late spring, summer to early autumn. It is an efficient approach for larger sites. Another method is called solarization. I've got just a little bit of experience with this, and I can tell you I've only used solarization on very small plots. So I don't have much experience on larger scale projects. The gist of this method is you mow or rake the weeds just like you did with the herbicide method. But instead of applying herbicide to the green up after you mow and rake, you cover that area with a UV stabilized plastic, which is meant to cook both the weeds that are trying to green up and even the weed seeds in those shallow soil areas. You remove the plastic in early autumn. And again, in my opinion, this is best suited for small sites, but if any of you watching this video have experience with utilizing this method on much larger sites, I would love to hear some feedback on that. I'd love to hear how successful it was, how you went about it. I think it's a great option, and the more information we can share on that, the better. Tilling, this is probably the most common approach that I've used on projects like this. My disclaimer here is that I'm not advocating repeated tilling throughout the years, so not tilling year after year after year after year, because I very much believe in no-till practices as it pertains to agriculture and certain other practices. However, tilling in this case is meant to break up vegetation that is very aggressive, has formed these really impenetrable sod layers. Basically, from a weed standpoint, if you have a very challenging situation in front of you, tilling is a great tool for that first year of site preparation. Once that native community is established, you don't till again. You let that be as a living soil. So that's my disclaimer on tilling. One approach that can be effective is you start to till the site in early spring, and you repeat that tilling throughout the growing season, with the idea being that you're flushing the weeds. So you allow the weed seeds to germinate after you've tilled, because every time you till, new weeds that are present as seeds in the seed bank are going to flush. They're going to germinate. And as soon as they green up, you till them again before they have a chance to form new seed and spit out new seed into your project area. So what this means is you have to till frequently enough, typically every 2 to 3 weeks, so that new germinants are not allowed to produce seed. What you're seeing here on the left is Tyler Dula, our conservation technical assistant at the Manistee Conservation District. He and I tilled this small plot at our office property in the summer of 2020, and I'll talk more on that in another slide. The picture on the right is an area in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This is a good friend of mine and a fellow forester who prepared a site for native wildflowers and grasses, and he also used a tilling method. Cover crops are a great tool to incorporate into these various site preparation methods. They can be used in conjunction with raking, mowing, herbicide, or tilling. Two common cover crops you might run into are rye and oats. I tend to prefer oats, and sometimes you can use a combination of the two. What I like about oats is that you can spend an entire spring and summer tilling, and then by late summer you can lay the oats down as a cover crop. They'll hold the site through the fall and into the winter until they winter kill on their own, and then that residue can be raked or disked in that following growing season, which helps the site be ready for native grasses and native wildflowers. And I'll talk more on that later. This URL you see at the bottom is a great resource published by NRCS that gives you common seeding rates as part of something called the Michigan Common Seeding Table. So if you want to look at different seeding rates for not just cover crops, but other types of species for different purposes, I really recommend you check out this table. It's a great resource. What you're seeing here, and by the way, this is a picture from what would normally be a video, but we posted this video as a standalone video on the Manistee Conservation District YouTube channel. So you can go to the same YouTube channel that you should be on right now if you're watching this video, and you can see Tyler explaining our site preparation method for this experimental plot at our office property. The gist of this project is in August of 2020, we delineated a 20 feet by 50 feet area. We tilled it. Then we planted 2 pounds of rye and a 1/4 pound of crimson clover as a cover crop. That's a pretty heavy rate, by the way, for 20 by 50, but we, because we didn't fertilize or lime, we just wanted to seed a little bit heavy and see what kind of green up we got. And the green up was pretty good. In September of 2020, we overseeded with an additional 3 pounds of oats to help fill in some of those other areas that just didn't get taken by the rye and the crimson clover. And the oats did fill it in. It looked really green and really covered by fall. So it was successful by our standards just to serve as a cover crop. In the growing season of 2021, we're going to either rake that vegetation in or lightly till it or lightly disc it. And we're going to plant oats again as a cover crop. And we're going to let those oats maintain the site through the winter of 2021 and 2022, in which case the oats will winter kill. And then by May of 2022, we can rake or disc that oat residue and plant our native wildflower and grass seed. So once you've decided on your site preparation methods, you need to decide what are you going to plant and how much. One of the first things to consider is what ratio of wildflowers and grasses do you want? This can vary depending on your goals. If you're looking for heavy bedding cover, for ground nesting songbirds, for white-tailed deer, just wildlife cover in general, a lot of times you'll bias your ratio a little high towards the grasses. A lot of folks don't necessarily know what they want. They want the flowers and they want the grasses, and I do recommend a mixture because you're providing different benefits based on both groups. So grasses are doing certain things and your native wildflowers are doing other things. So what we often end up recommending is a 50-50 mixture where 50% is wildflowers and then 50% is native grasses. Typically in Northwest Lower Peninsula, Michigan, the grasses that we'll recommend are big blue stem, little blue stem. Those are by far the two most common. And then sometimes we'll incorporate June grass into that mixture. In terms of choosing wildflowers, what we encourage is to pick a range that represents a range of blooming periods. So in other words, wildflowers that bloom everywhere from early spring and early summer to late summer, early fall. In this case, what you're seeing on the right is a range of blooming periods, such as beard tongue, which is an early summer bloomer, wild bergamot and black-eyed Susan, which is roughly midsummer blooming, and then stiff goldenrod, which is late summer, early fall. And a lot of times, if you get a seed mixture from a conservation district that participates in NRCS cost share programs, oftentimes the wildflower seed mix does represent that range of bloom periods. Planting methods. So you've done your site preparation and you've decided what it is you want to plant. You've decided on your wildflower to grass ratio. You've decided which kind of species you want to put in the ground in terms of both the grasses and the wildflowers. So how are you going to put them in the ground? Here I want to mention plugs, which essentially are root plugs that come with a plant that's already several inches tall, and you'll buy them in flats. So you see these flats that have a certain number of plugs in the cells of the flat. These are plants that have already germinated and again are already several inches tall. These, in my opinion, are best for small plots, small scale projects, because the price is a lot more per capita to plant via plugs than to plant by seed. And I want to mention here that a lot of the presentation that you're seeing right now is geared towards getting a site ready and distributing plants as if you're planting by seed. But I want to make sure you're aware that plugs are also an option for small scale projects. An example of how the price tag for plugs and the labor can add up if you're trying to implement a larger scale project is using a 0.5 acre plot. So if you're going to plant plugs at a 12-inch spacing, which is a pretty common spacing when you're putting plugs in the ground and you want them to occupy the growing space, you would have to plant 21,780 plugs to fill in half an acre at a 12-inch spacing. That's a pretty daunting task. However, if you're doing a small scale project like 10 by 10, 20 by 20, even 30 by 30 feet, something like that, if you have the money and you have the time, plugs are an awesome way to get that instant gratification by popping those plants in the ground, and you're going to have flowers right away. Things are going to happen for you right away. The pictures you're seeing on the right are showing plugs. So the top picture, what you're seeing there is it's an experiment that we ran in partnership with the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network. In 2017, I believe this was, we delineated a plot dominated by spotted knapweed and smooth brome. We mowed that vegetation down. All we did was mow it. Then we planted plugs of little bluestem, big bluestem, and wild lupin. The wild lupin did not make it. We kind of expected that. But the little bluestem and the big bluestem have actually expanded, and they've taken that growing space where we planted those plugs, and it looks fantastic. So in other words, the knapweed and the brome did not easily recolonize those areas where we planted the little bluestem and the big bluestem plugs. And I would say that's a successful experiment in terms of one way to go about taking control of growing space in these areas where exotic plants such as knapweed and brome dominate. The bottom picture you're seeing there is just our sign at our office, and around that sign we planted native herbaceous plugs for the last several years, and we maintain that area by weeding it, and we keep filling it in with native vegetation just as a cool little demonstration area of native plugs. So for projects where labor and financial resources are limited, planting by seed is definitely the best option. The bottom left picture you're seeing there is just a bag of seed sold by the Manistee Conservation District. And the picture in the middle and then on the right is of myself and then Renee Mallison, our executive director. The pictures here are a bit misleading because we're actually spreading cover crop seed. That's not native wildflower and native grass seed. Those plots you see are some additional plots we have at our 40-acre parcel in Caliba, and we're not at the point where we're ready to plant the native wildflower and native grass seeds. So we tilled those areas just like we did at the plot on the office property. And what you're seeing there is us spreading oats as a cover crop. So which season to plant? You're going to get lots of different opinions about this. This is similar to the debate you'll hear about spring versus fall with planting trees and shrubs. A similar debate occurs with planting native wildflower and grass seed. The answer is either one. It depends on your preference and your local conditions. If you're going to do a fall planting, typically in Northwest Lower Peninsula, Michigan, you're going to do this after November 1st. You can do grasses or wildflowers at this time via seed. And this can be particularly beneficial for wildflower seed that requires something called cold stratification. And by that, I mean certain wildflower species have to go through a period of cold temperatures before they can break dormancy and germinate. So when you're spreading seed in November, typically those wildflowers that require cold stratification will germinate that very next growing season because they've sat in the ground through that Michigan winter. A negative trade-off to this, and one that I've directly observed by spreading seed in November where I live, is sometimes you get these interesting warm spells that can actually cause seeds to germinate prematurely. And I have had that happen. Like I just mentioned, I spread seed in November one year just as a small experiment, and we had a pretty long warm spell, and I had seeds that actually germinated that same fall. You do not want that to happen. If you're spreading seed in November, you want that seed to remain dormant until the next growing season. So just something to be aware of with interesting weather patterns. Planting in the spring is another option. This is actually my preferred season. In northern Michigan, spring planting in general is considered May 15th to June 15th, so not defined the same way as a spring planting for trees and shrubs, which is April. Now, you will see some folks who plant much earlier than May 15th, and there's some debate to be had there, but I tend to stick to mid-May or after for spreading seed if I'm doing a spring planting of wildflowers and grasses. For wildflowers that require that cold stratification, something to keep in mind is if you do a spring planting, there are certain species that are not going to germinate that first year when you do the planting. It just won't happen because they have to have that cold stratification. What will happen is that seed will sit dormant in the soil that first growing season. It'll go through a Michigan winter, and then the second growing season, it will germinate. Fluctuating weather patterns are not as much of a concern if you do a spring planting, but drought can be a factor. So how much seed to plant? Again, another answer that if you ask 100 people, you might get 100 different answers. Some people recommend really low rates. Others recommend pretty high rates. I like to think that this 10 pounds per acre total is somewhere in between the really low and the really high. But again, one opinion varies from one professional to the next. I've had good success with this rate that you see on the slide. And if you're doing that 50-50 mixture at a total of 10 pounds per acre, then you could do something like 2.5 pounds per acre of big blue stem, 2.5 pounds per acre of little blue, and 5 pounds per acre of native wildflowers. The other thing to keep in mind here is this is your rate as a goal. That is not the same as what you will actually spread on the ground. And I'm going to explain that in the next slide. So back to one component of the last example, if your desired rate or your goal rate for native wildflower seed is 5 pounds per acre, then you need to adjust this based on certain factors, like the information provided by the seed vendor. So if your seed tags indicate that the percent pure seed is 98.95%, the germination percent is 55%, and the dormant seed percent is 20%, then you can adjust your actual seeding rate or your bulk seeding rate by running a calculation as follows. So if your goal is 5 pounds per acre of successful seed on the ground, you take that number and you divide it by that percent pure live seed, 0.9895 times 0.55 as your germination plus 0.2 as your dormant seed. And this basically yields a bulk rate of 6.74 pounds per acre. So in other words, you're throwing out 6.74 pounds per acre to achieve your goal of 5 pounds per acre. And I also suggest you just round numbers like that up. So if your calculation says 6.74, just round it to 7 to make things easier in terms of purchasing seed. This rate will differ for the grasses, so you have to run this calculation for each type of plant, if that makes sense. Another approach is simply knowing that your seed vendor is providing high quality, high germination seed and just putting a rate out there that you know works. Some people will say, well, I know that the vendor I get my seed from has a good germination success. I'm not going to run through this bulk seeding rate calculation. I'm just going to throw out 6 pounds of wildflower seed per acre, and I know that's going to work. That's a very common approach. You don't necessarily have to run through these calculations, but I just want to help you understand that there is math that can go into this sometimes, and you want to make sure you're reading seed tags because sometimes seed vendors are selling seed that is not adequate. You might have a really, really low germination rate and you're not getting what you think you're getting. I'll refer you to this common seeding table again that I referenced in the cover crop slide. So again, this table has lots of good information on seeding rates. So preparing the seed bed. So where are we at? You've done your site preparation. You've decided which species you want to plant. You've decided your wildflower to grass ratio. You've decided which method you want to plant, whether that be plugs or seed. This next slide pertains mainly to if you're spreading via seed. So again, you've done your site prep, you've chosen your species, you are ready to put the native seed in the ground. So let's say you did a cover crop and it winter killed. You can rake or disc that area at the time of planting your native seed, making sure that at least 50% of the area has visible soil so there's good seed to soil contact. If you implemented other methods like herbicide, the approach would be the same. Basically, whatever biomass residue you have on your site after you did your site preparation methods, you want to make sure that you do a light disking or raking so that you expose at least 50% visible soil so there's good seed to soil contact for the native wildflower and native grass seed that you're about to spread on the ground. Another good approach here is to use a cultipacker or a lawn roller to flatten the ground so that you don't have areas that are too deep for the native seed, and I'll explain that in a subsequent slide. This is especially concerning if you're using a machine cultipacker. I've been on 1 or 2 sites recently where the landowner used a machine cultipacker to flatten the ground, quote unquote. However, the grooves that were created by that cultipacker actually were too deep for the native seeds. So any seed that would fall in those grooves would be too deep in the ground, and the germination would fail. So flatten really does mean flatten. So one thing this landowner did was follow up after the cultipacking with a roller that he hooked to his tractor to get some of those grooves evened out. So how are you going to spread the seed? Couple options here. Hand spreading is one very common option, and it's the one that I have the most experience with by far. Even if I was working on a 8, 9, or 10 acre field, I would spread the seed by hand. I would put the seed in the filler in buckets, and I would walk the site and spread it by hand. But there are other options. There's something called a no-till drill, and this is a great option for large sites. Had I had access to a no-till drill on some of these projects I worked on years ago, I would have been all for that. I think that would have made things much more efficient, but I have very little experience with the no-till drill. I'm still learning. It's a great option for large sites. A lot of folks with the no-till drill, an approach they might take is they might prepare the site by using a herbicide to kill the weeds, at least the green parts of weeds. They might plant a cover crop as some sort of nurse crop, and they will drill the native seed right into the soil. And that's what you're seeing there is a tractor pulling that drill, and the seed is getting drilled directly into the soil. So again, you can drill that seed right into a cover crop, and then as those native seeds germinate, you can mow back that cover crop and release the native seed. And by leaving the cover crop on, you're actually helping minimize additional weeds that might try to colonize the site. That bottom picture there is a tractor pulling the no-till drill. It's one that we rent actually at the Manistee Conservation District. You can rent a no-till drill through us. And the picture on the right are some staff members from the Mason Lake Conservation District spreading seed by hand with the filler. If you're spreading by hand, a carrier is super important. If you've ever bought native seed, such as native wildflowers and native grasses, and you've tossed it onto a site, you can just see how light and fluffy it is, and the wind can take it away really easily. If you're just tossing it onto a site, as soon as you have a wind come through, it can easily carry the seed to places where you don't want it to be, even if you flatten it into the soil using a lawn roller or a cultipacker. So fillers are really helpful to weigh that seed down and ensure that it stays in place and maintains that seed to soil contact. There are all kinds of fillers out there that you can use. I prefer the inert fillers, such as sawdust, sand, cracked corn, rice hulls. These are fillers that are not going to turn into any sort of plant. But some people take an interesting approach, and they'll use something like oats as a filler, and the oats will actually germinate and become a plant, and then those oats will act as a nurse crop, just the same as if you incorporated the oats cover crop in combination with the no-till drill method. So I have seen people throw the native seed along with oats, knowing that the oats are going to germinate, and then you high mow those oats back and help release the native seed as it's germinating. But again, my experience has mainly been using inert fillers with my seed and doing site preparation methods that prepare the site to simply throw the native seed with the filler when it's ready to do so. So I alluded to this earlier, planting depth. You can look up different species of wildflowers and grasses and see that there are maximum depths for a lot of them. They're not all the same from one species to the next or from one group of plants to the next. However, keep in mind that a lot of times when you're planting native wildflowers and native grasses, you're mixing the seed together and you're planting them all together. So that being the case, my general recommendation is to not plant deeper than 1/4 inch to accommodate the most sensitive species in that mix in terms of planting depth. So 1/4 inch is a good rule of thumb. And this is not the same as cover crop seed. Some cover crop seed, you actually want to get 1/2 inch or deeper in the ground for good germination. So if you're distributing a cover crop, as a site preparation method, your planting depth is going to be different than when you put your native seed in the ground. So just keep that in mind and refer to that Michigan seeding table that I provided a URL for in previous slides. The depth can be set with the no-till drill. And if you're hand seeding, this is where you want to make sure whatever flattening method you're using, like the lawn roller or the cultipacker, is creating adequate depth. So back to that example where the cultipacker created grooves that were too deep. You want to make sure that's not happening. When you spread your native seed, you can flatten the ground before you spread the native seed, and then you can do it afterward. But whatever method you do, you want to make sure that that seed is not deeper than a 1/4 inch in the ground so that it'll adequately germinate. The picture on the left there is just me running a lawnmower, not a lawnmower, but a lawn roller rather, on one of our experimental plots. This is one of our plots out at our 40-acre parcel in Caliba. And then the picture on the right is just another picture of the no-till drill. Irrigation and fertilization. If you're doing a spring seeding, you can water right away, and then you may need to water after that. It depends on if drought conditions persist, but the irrigation really depends on whether you're going to have drought conditions or not, which, as you know, have becoming more and more common in Northwest Lower Michigan. It's been a problem for trees and shrubs as well as wildflower and grass establishment. So just be ready to have a plan in place to get water on those plots. As far as fertilization and liming, if you have matched the wildflowers and grasses to the soil type, typically you're not going to need to fertilize. You might need to lime to adjust the pH. What adjusting a pH does is it unlocks certain nutrients in terms of their availability to plants. So there sometimes are nutrients there in the soil, but their availability can depend on the pH. If you've ever looked at a chart showing pH and nutrient availability, you'll notice at a pH of 7, there are all these different nutrients that become widely available. And that's why a lot of people try to adjust pH to get it closer to neutral. The thing to be cautious of is a lot of these native plants that you're trying to establish are adapted to some of these crummier soils. And if you over fertilize or you adjust the pH too much and you make this soil too ideal for too many different types of plants, you're actually creating a counterproductive situation where you're favoring weeds. You're creating an amended soil essentially that's going to favor all kinds of weeds that you don't want coming in and competing with these native grasses and native wildflowers that are already adapted to the inherent properties of that soil. I still recommend getting what's called a soil test just to see what your baseline data is for that soil in terms of your pH and your nutrients. And you can get a soil test through Michigan State University Extension. So initial follow-up and what to expect. Something that may or may not be a problem is browsing by white-tailed deer. This is really context dependent. You're going to want to watch your local deer herds and see how they're reacting to your plants. If you are pretty sure that deer are going to start going after those germinants as soon as you spread your native seed, I suggest being proactive and getting some kind of repellent around your planting area and even in the middle of your planting area if you want to spend the money on that. But what a lot of people have tried, and I've had some success with this as well, is spreading 1 or 2 perimeters of a repellent, such as a blood meal repellent, around the planting area. These granular formulations of blood meal will typically last several months before you have to reapply. So that's one method that you can use to try to keep the deer off those areas as your plants are trying to establish so they don't get gobbled up before they have a chance to become productive plants. And other than that, just make sure that your expectations are realistic. So I can't emphasize this enough. During year 1 of a planting, it is not going to look pretty. I've had quite a few landowners call me and walk their property when they first spread their native seed, and they think it failed. And in some cases, it did end up failing for different reasons, but how pretty it looks that first year is not really the way to gauge that. So a lot of times when I've walked these areas, when you look really close, you'll see that a lot of these tiny little germinates popping up are actually the native plants from the seed that was spread. So these pictures you see of these beautiful charismatic tallgrass prairies, your site is not going to look like that the first year. A lot of these plants need years just to get their root systems established and do things so that they can occupy that growing space before they're going to really start to show you their potential. So during that first year, if your overall vegetation height gets taller than 12 inches, you can do something called high mowing by mowing that area back to a height of 6 inches. And what this does is it knocks back the weeds quite a bit, especially those annual weeds, because by mowing those back, you can really put a hurting on those annual weed populations and prevent them from going to seed and spitting out new weed seed into your plot. So high mowing is a good approach for that first year. And you can also spot spray weeds with herbicide, which does require you to be able to differentiate between the native plants and the exotic plants. And that takes a little bit of training. During the second growing season, in early spring, you can rake away the debris. Then throughout the growing season, you can mow down those annual and biennial weeds, whatever you're seeing. Again, identification is key here to be able to separate the natives from the exotics. You can spot treat all types of weeds with the herbicide. And what some folks recommend during the second growing season is another high mowing method where you let the vegetation get taller than, let's say, 12 to 14 inches, and then you can mow it back to about 8 to 10 inches instead of 6 inches. If by the end of the second growing season, more than 75% of the ground cover is still dominated by exotic weeds, then you should probably consider reseeding or overseeding. In other words, you are going to be restarting to an extent. So this 75% rule, I think, is a good way to gauge it in terms of what you need to do. And patience is key, like I already mentioned. These plantings will take years before the results are truly noticeable. If you pass the test laid out in the first bullet point there, so if you don't have more than 75% of your plot dominated by these exotic weeds, you can proceed under what would be considered typical maintenance for these native plantings. And by year 3, you could do something like introduce prescribed fire if feasible. I understand that socially this is not always possible, and even logistically it can be a huge challenge. But I just want to throw that out there that fire is a great tool to introduce by year 3 if it's possible. If it's not, you can implement a mowing practice as a substitute to help rejuvenate that native plant community starting in year 3, really year 4 in my opinion, but there's a little bit of debate on that topic. If prescribed fire is used, try to burn only portions of an area at a time because certain breeding birds tend to utilize breeding habitat on the site. So in other words, don't rip a fire through your entire project area all in one entry. Try to be mindful of where certain breeding birds are nesting so that you don't cause harm to those. Something else to consider is incorporating native trees and shrubs at extremely wide spacings within the project area. This provides additional structural diversity, and it's just charismatically, it's pretty cool in my opinion. And the most common habitat people associate with what I'm describing here is called savanna habitat. So if you've ever been in a savanna habitat in the Midwest, you'll see widely spaced oak trees, like bur oak, for example, scattered amongst native grasses and native wildflowers. It's a really cool ecosystem. Some landowners like to have that mixture of the scattered native woody plants along with their native wildflowers and native grasses. So keep that in mind. That's also an option. Financial assistance. If you work with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, there is cost share money to help offset the cost of implementing projects like this. And because there's such a huge push for pollinator habitat, there are actually some pretty high cost share rates tied to the planting of native grasses and native wildflowers. So you can talk to your local NRCS district conservationist. The information's easy to look up. I would start by just calling your local conservation district and then asking about cost share money for planting native wildflowers and native grasses. This is typically done through a program called EQIP or the Conservation Stewardship Program. I just want to highlight one success story in Manistee County. This, again, is a picture of what's actually a video that you can see on our YouTube channel. And it's describing a project in the Onekama area of Manistee County. Ironically, I did this interview and described what happened, but I actually had little to do with the implementation of this project. It happened when I first started here at the Conservation District, but Scott Huey, our NRCS person at the Bear Lake office, was nice enough to share the information with me and tell me what happened. And then I went out on the site and just identified what plants flourished. And to me, this was a great example of a success story. So what this landowner did was mowed the area in summer and fall of 2015. Following the mowing, he applied a foliar herbicide. And then that same November, he planted native seed. So he did that dormant seeding in November. And now in 2020, that picture you're seeing there is from the summer of 2020. You can see how much it flourished. It looks gorgeous. He's got things like beard tongue, bergamot, big blue stem, black-eyed Susan, gray-headed coneflower, little blue stem, purple coneflower, and vervain. So it looks really great. There were some goldenrods in there as well. They hadn't flowered at the time when I went out there to film this video, but it's definitely what I would call a success story. And this was funded partially by NRCS. I just want to plug, no pun intended, some native herbaceous plant plug sales. So on June 11th of this year, our conservation district, in partnership with Bird's Foot Nursery and likely some other partners such as Plant It Wild and perhaps another local nursery, are going to be having a native herbaceous plant sale in the form of plant plugs. So these sales are where you can buy those flats of the plants with the root plugs that are already several inches tall. And a few Friends for the Environment, in partnership with Bird's Foot Nursery and Designs by Nature, are going to be doing the same type of sale on Saturday, June 12th. So the one for the Manistee Conservation District is going to be in Manistee County, and then a Fuse sale will be down in Mason County. So I just want to let you know that those things are going to be happening in June. Just stay tuned for more details. And I also want to point out that the Manistee and Mason Lake Conservation Districts, as well as many other conservation districts, sell native wildflower and native grass seed year-round. So if you want to buy these things in the form of seed, just contact your local conservation district, and the seed is pretty easy to get. But these native herbaceous plant sales via plugs are typically timed events during certain parts of the year. With that, I want to thank some folks, including the authors of the papers that I often cited throughout this presentation at MSU and Xerces Society. I also want to thank my peers at the Manistee and the Mason Lake Conservation Districts. They've been a great help in terms of supporting me and providing comments on this presentation. And of course, the labor they provide for some of the projects that we're getting on the ground. And I want to give a special thanks to Susie Knoll, who's the Executive Director of the Oceana Conservation District, because she provided some really helpful feedback on earlier versions of this presentation. Here are some references and photo credits. And if you have questions, this is my contact information.